that you know how to enhance your own knowledge of Google Classroom, let's talk about creating your digital classrooms for this year. As teachers, one tried and true thing we do before the start of a new school year is we set up our physical classroom space. We put the desks where we want them, we put our bulletin boards up, we think about the classroom space, and we decide where things will go, where materials will go, and how our students will use the space for their learning. We create the learning space for our students, trying to make it as conducive for learning as possible. We also plan out our classroom rules, procedures, and expectations. How will students get materials if they need them? How and when can students ask questions during class? We plan all these things out and then usually communicate these procedures and expectations with our students and parents during the first few days of school. Our remote learning classroom needs to be created with the same end in mind. How can I plan and create an online learning environment for my students that makes it as conducive to learning as possible? Now's the time to think and plan out those details for your remote learning classroom. What are my expectations for students? Where in my digital classroom will I post announcements for my students? Where will I post assignments? How will students communicate with me? How will they turn assignments into me? These are all questions to think about and plan accordingly for as you set up your digital hub. On this slide, we've provided links to help students get joined into Classroom as a student, as well as a parent guide that would be useful to send home to parents to keep them knowledgeable about Google Classroom as well. These are both things that I recommend sending home to students or going over with students and parents the first few days of school. So a few things to consider as you're creating your online environment. Let's look at a Google Classroom right here. The stream. How do you want to use the stream with your students? It could be a place where you, as the teacher, post announcements. But think about it. Will you allow students to use the stream to ask questions or engage in conversation with their peers? If not, are you going to turn off the student comment in the settings so that students won't have the ability to post and ask questions here? If you are going to use this for student conversation, then how will you instruct your students and what is the appropriate online conversations that can be had on your digital classroom? So think about that and decide how you want to best use the stream with your students. Then we have the Classwork page. So is this where you want to post materials and assignments? If so, how and will you use the topic sections or create your own topics so that you can organize your materials and assignments? Will you require students to turn in assignments on Google Classroom? If so, how will you teach your students to do this? How will they know that this is what is the expectation for them to do? How do you want students to ask questions for you when they have general questions about your class? Do you want them to email you, or do you want them to use the private messaging feature on Google Classroom? These are all different things to think about. In the People's tab, are you going to invite parents and guardians and add them into your classroom? There is no right or wrong way to set up your digital learning environment. The important thing is to establish your expectations and procedures before remote learning begins so that you are prepared for the transition, and so are your students. Also included on this slide are two links to useful resources that I think you will enjoy. This one right here is an article that discusses the advanced and somewhat unique ways you could use Google Classroom with your students, not just in remote learning, but for day-to-day instructional practices as well. This is definitely worth a look for those wanting to learn more or find new ways or new uses for Google Classroom. So this is a really good one that I encourage you to take a few minutes and investigate. The next one is an article about the flipped classroom model of instruction. So if you've never dabbled or tried flipped learning in your classroom before, and now since NTI, we're all a little more able to create our own screencast videos, flipped learning might be a great instructional tool to try. Think of it as a way to almost teach with yourself. This article is a great read to get you started or learning more about flipping your classroom.